Imagine waking up to find bulldozers on your property tearing down everything you worked for, all without your consent. That's exactly what happened to me. And the worst part, the HOA was behind it. I had spent my entire life working for this house. Blood, sweat, and years of sacrifice went into building my dream home, $1 million estate that was supposed to be my legacy. Every brick, every beam, every detail was a reflection of my hard work. Nestled in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in town, my property stood as a testament to everything I had achieved. But in just a matter of hours, it was all ripped away from me, and the people responsible, the very homeowners association that was supposed to protect our community. It all started with a letter, a simple envelope in my mailbox. Nothing fancy, just a white envelope with the HOA's letterhead printed in the corner. I had received letters from them before, usually about trivial matters, reminders to trim the bushes, repaint my mailbox, or maintain the community aesthetic. But this one was different. The words on the page sent a shiver down my spine. Notice of non-compliance. Your property violates HOA guidelines and must be corrected immediately. Failure to comply will result in legal action. I read it again, my heart pounding in my chest. What violation? I had followed every rule when I built my home. I had gone through every approval process. There was no way this could be real. I turned the letter over hoping for some clarification, but all it said was that my house no longer aligned with the updated community guidelines and that I had 60 days to make the necessary changes. Furious, I drove straight to the HOA office. The moment I walked in, I felt the cold corporate atmosphere suffocate me. The office was pristine, almost too perfect. White walls, framed certificates, and an oversized desk where Richard, the HOA president, sat like a king overseeing his kingdom. Richard had always been the type of guy who loved control. With his slicked back hair and designer suit, he looked more like a CEO than a neighborhood committee member. I had never trusted him, and now standing in front of him, I knew why. "Ah, Mr. Turner," Richard said, barely looking up from his papers. "I was expecting you." I slammed the letter onto his desk. "What the hell is this, Richard? What violation are you talking about?" He sighed and leaned back in his chair, folding his hands like a patient teacher explaining a lesson to a troublesome student. "Your property no longer aligns with the community's revised architectural standards," he said. "Revised? Since when?" I snapped. "We sent out notices 6 months ago." He pulled out a thick binder and slid it across the table. "Page 47. All homes must now follow the Mediterranean aesthetic. Your modern-style home is no longer compliant." I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. There it was, buried among dozens of new regulations. They had changed the rules. Rules I had never agreed to, and according to them, my house was now a visual disruption to the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. "This is insane," I said, pushing the binder away. "I built this house with full approval. You can't just change the rules and expect me to tear it down." "We're not asking you to tear it down," Richard said smoothly. "We're simply asking you to remodel it according to the new guidelines." "Remodel? Do you have any idea how much that would cost?" I could feel my blood boiling. This wasn't a simple paint job. They were talking about restructuring the entire exterior, redesigning the facade, changing the roof, replacing the windows. It would cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. "We understand that changes can be costly," Richard said, feigning sympathy. "But rules are rules. You have 60 days to comply, or we will be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" I demanded. Richard finally looked me in the eye, a smug grin creeping onto his face. "If you fail to comply, the HOA has the authority to enforce corrections at your expense." I left the office seething. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about power. Richard and his board wanted complete control over the neighborhood, and my house was their latest target. But I wasn't about to go down without a fight. For the next few weeks, I did everything I could to challenge them. I consulted lawyers, attended HOA meetings, even rallied some of my neighbors, but no one wanted to go against Richard. They were either too afraid or too indifferent to care. And as the deadline approached, the letters became more aggressive. "Final warning, Failure to comply will result in enforcement action. Then, one morning, I woke up to the sound of engines rumbling outside my house. I rushed to my window and my heart nearly stopped. Bulldozers, trucks, construction workers. I ran outside, screaming at them to stop, but they ignored me. The demolition had begun. "Who gave you permission to do this?" I yelled. A man in a hard hat handed me a document. It was an enforcement order from the HOA granting them the authority to correct my property. And the worst part, they were charging me for it. I tried to call the police, but they told me it was a civil matter. My lawyer said it would take months to fight this in court. By the time I could do anything, my house would be gone. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next few days, I watched helplessly as the walls were torn down, the roof was ripped apart, and the structure I had built with my own hands was reduced to rubble. I had lost everything. But what Richard and the HOA didn't realize was that I wasn't going to let this go. I had nothing left to lose, and I was going to make sure they paid for what they did. I stood in the middle of the wreckage, my heart pounding in my chest. My home, my $1 million dream, was gone. The very place I had poured my life savings into was nothing but rubble. The air was thick with dust, the ground littered with shattered glass and broken bricks. Workers moved around, indifferent to the destruction they had caused. I clenched my fists. This wasn't over. Richard and the HOA thought they had won. They thought they could bulldoze my property, send me a bill, and move on like nothing happened. But they underestimated me. That night, I barely slept. I spent hours researching homeowner rights, HOA abuse cases, and legal loopholes. I knew I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could fight back. And if there was one thing I was good at, it was winning fights I wasn't supposed to win. The fight began. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, David, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He had handled some nasty cases before, but when I showed him the pictures of my destroyed home, even he looked stunned. "This is one of the worst cases I've seen," he admitted, flipping through the enforcement order. "They overstepped their authority, no doubt about it. But the problem is, they covered their tracks well." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Technically, they followed the revised community guideline, and since you signed an agreement when you bought the house, the court might side with them." I shook my head. "That's insane. I never agreed to these changes." David sighed. "They'll argue that they sent notices, and when you didn't comply, they had the right to enforce correction. It's a legal gray area." But he hesitated, flipping through another document. I narrowed my eyes. "But what?" David looked up at me. "There might be another way." Uncovering the truth, David's plan was simple: follow the money. We started digging into the HOA's financial records, public permits, and internal documents. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just the typical HOA expenses and neighborhood upkeep reports. But then, we found something shocking. The HOA hadn't just torn down my house to correct the aesthetic. They had already sold my land. 3 weeks before the demolition, Richard and the board approved a private sale of my lot to a real estate developer. And guess what? The developer had plans to build luxury townhomes. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about community guidelines. This was a land grab, and Richard had personally profited from it. We found emails between him and the developer discussing my lot like it was already theirs. They had been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect excuse to strike. And since I had refused to comply, they had used their authority to steal my property. I clenched my jaw. They thought I was just another homeowner they could steamroll. They had no idea what was coming. Exposing the HOA corruption, armed with evidence, I went public. I reached out to news stations, local journalists, and even social media's influencers who exposed corrupt HOAs. The story spread like wildfire. People were outraged. Within days, a full-blown investigation was launched into Richard and the HOA. The backlash was so intense that homeowners who had stayed silent before finally spoke up. Turns out, I wasn't the only victim. Other homeowners had been bullied, fined, and even forced to sell their homes at a loss just so the HOA could flip the properties for a profit. This was a pattern. Richard had run this HOA like a mafia, using his position to steal homes and sell them under the table. But now his entire empire was crumbling. Richard's downfall. One night, as I was reviewing new evidence, my phone rang. It was David. His voice was tense. "We got him." I sat up. "What do you mean?" "An anonymous whistleblower just leaked internal HOA financial record. Richard has been embezzling funds for years. We have enough to take him down." The next morning, the FBI raided the HOA office. Richard was arrested on multiple charges: fraud, embezzlement, and real estate corruption. The entire HOA board was dissolved, and a federal investigation was launched. My land was legally returned to me, but the damage was already done. My house was gone. The years of memories, the hard work, it had all been wiped away. But you know what? I wasn't sad. I was victorious. I had fought back. I had exposed them, and now I was going to rebuild. The day after the FBI raided the HOA office, the entire community was buzzing. Richard was in handcuffs. The HOA was being dismantled, and suddenly all the homeowners who had been bullied for years had hope. But for me, the fight wasn't over yet. Yes, I had exposed the corruption. Yes, Richard was finally paying for his crimes, but that didn't change the fact that my $1 million home was gone, and I wanted justice. The lawsuit begins. David wasted no time filing a massive lawsuit against the HOA, Richard, and the real estate developers who had bought my land. It wasn't just about me anymore. Other homeowners who had been victims of the same scheme joined the lawsuit. We were going after everything. The case gained national attention. News outlets ran segments about HOA abuse and corruption, using my story as a prime example of how homeowners were being exploited. Social media exploded with #HoScam, and even state politicians started calling for new laws to protect homeowners from these kinds of schemes. Richard's personal assets were frozen. The developer backed out of the deal when they saw the legal firestorm coming their way. The new HOA leadership tried to negotiate, but I wasn't interested in settlements. I wanted every single dollar back. Richard's worst nightmare. The lawsuit dragged on for months, but we had one advantage. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails, financial records, testimonies from ex-HOA board members. Everything proved that Richard and his corrupt board had used their power to steal homes and flip them for profit. Richard, once the smug king of the HOA, was now a disgraced man facing 25 years in prison. And as the trial continued, I made sure he felt the full weight of what he had done. One day in court, Richard looked at me with pure hatred. "You could have just taken a payout and moved on," he hissed under his breath. I smiled. "You could have just followed the law and stayed out of prison." That shut him up real quick, winning big. After nearly a year of legal battles, the court ruled in my favor. I was awarded $3.5 million, far more than the value of my original home. Other homeowners received millions in settlements as well. The HOA was completely dissolved, and a new homeowner-friendly community association was put in place. As for the land, the judge ruled that I had full rights to rebuild, but I had other plans. The ultimate revenge. Instead of rebuilding a new home, I turned my land into something that would haunt Richard forever. With the settlement money, I built a community park. That's right. Richard's precious stolen property was now a public space where families could gather, kids could play, and neighbors could enjoy their community without fear of HOA corruption. And the best part, I named the park Freedom Park. Right at the entrance, there was a massive plaque with the full story of how the HOA had tried to steal this land and how we fought back and won. Richard, still sitting in prison, would hear about it for the rest of his miserable life. The legacy. The story didn't end there. Because of the publicity from the case, state lawmakers pushed for new HOA regulations that would prevent similar corruption in the future. Other communities across the country started fighting back against their abusive HOAs, using my case as a precedent. I'd lost my home, but I had won so much more. And every time I walked through Freedom Park, watching kids laugh and families enjoy what was once stolen as land, I knew one thing: I had taken everything back. With the HOA completely dismantled and Richard serving his well-deserved prison sentence, my battle was finally over, or so I thought. But what I didn't expect was how my story would inspire thousands of homeowners across the country. The ripple effect. After the news of my lawsuit spread, I started getting emails, messages, and even phone calls from homeowners who had suffered similar abuse. One couple in Arizona had their home foreclosed illegally by their HOA over a $200 fine. A retired veteran in Texas lost his entire property because his fence was the wrong color. A single mother in Florida was kicked out of her home because her grass wasn't trimmed to HOA standards. It was a nationwide epidemic of corruption, and people were fed up. Becoming an advocate. I never planned on becoming an activist, but the more I heard these stories, the more I realized this wasn't just about me. People needed help. So I started a YouTube channel and blog where I shared my story, exposed HOA corruption, and gave homeowners legal strategies to fight back. The response was explosive. Within months, my videos were getting millions of views. I was invited onto news stations, podcasts, and even national TV shows to talk about HOA fraud and abuse. And then, something incredible happened. The government takes action. Thanks to the national outrage caused by my case, lawmakers started proposing new laws to regulate HOAs. Several states passed HOA Homeowner Protection Acts, limiting the power of HOAs, preventing them from stealing property, and ensuring real oversight. Even federal lawmakers started looking into nationwide reforms. The corrupt HOAs that had gotten away with theft for decades were now under investigation. And Richard, he had more company in prison. Many of his business partners and other HOA board members across the country were also getting arrested for similar crimes. The future of my community. As for my neighborhood, it completely transformed. With Richard and his corrupt team gone, the new community leadership focused on helping homeowners, not exploiting them. The outrageous fees were removed. Homeowners now had a real say in the rules. And Freedom Park, it became the heart of the community. Every weekend, families gathered there for events. Kids played freely and neighbors bonded over the place that once represented corruption, but now symbolized victory. Every time I walked through the park, I'd see the plaque that told the full story of how we fought back and won. And every time someone asked me about it, I'd smile and say, they tried to steal my land, but I made sure they could never steal from anyone else again. The final lesson. My journey taught me something important. You can fight back against injustice. Too many people live in fear of their HOAs, accepting abuse because they think they have no power. But that's exactly what corrupt people want you to believe. In reality, when you stand up for yourself, expose corruption, and refuse to back down, you can achieve something bigger than just revenge. You can create real change. I may have lost my house, but I gained a movement. And now, thanks to that fight, thousands of homeowners will never have to go through what I did, because we fought back and we won.